Greetings of peace upon you all. In my tradition, it would be Assalamu alaikum, or again, peace be upon you all. I really wish that I could be with you and I could see you. Unfortunately, you're meeting at a very difficult time for the US time zone, so please forgive me for not being able to join you. My name is Azza Karam, and I have the privilege and the responsibility of serving a worldwide movement of interreligious institutions, organizations called Religions for Peace. In case you do not know it, we think of it as the United Nations of Religions. The United Nations has member states or governments. Religions for Peace has member religious institutions, all religious institutions, representing all the religions, representatives from all faith traditions where there are no institutions, as well as interfaith youth networks and women of faith networks. This global movement has been around for 50 years, and it has national presence in the form of interreligious councils in 92 countries and in 4 regions. It is a global movement of multi-religious collaboration, which is something I wanted to take the opportunity to reflect with for a few minutes with you today. Before joining Religions for Peace on March 1, 2020, 2 weeks before the national lockdown in New York City, as it had become the center of the COVID epidemic. Before joining Religions for Peace, I worked for 20 years in the United Nations, where my job was to ensure that the United Nations system, not just the organizations I worked for, UNDP and UNFPA, but the system of the United Nations itself was more understanding, more collaborative, more appreciative, more determined of and to working with religious actors. Who are these religious actors? They're religious institutions like mosques, churches, synagogues, temples. They are also religious leaders who may not necessarily be affiliated with a particular church or mosque or temple. They are leaders of their communities. But also religious NGOs like yourselves, committed and dedicated to mission and working to serve all. So this universe of religious leaders, religious institutions, religious communities, and religious NGOs is a very big universe. And I spent a lot of time training approximately 500 United Nations staff over the years, since 2010 to be specific, but training and working with them to be able to have them appreciate and reflect critically on the work that they do and that they should do with religious actors in their diversity. There were many stereotypes that I came across from the UN system about religion and religious actors. They are stereotypes that are, as any stereotype, informed by the lack of knowledge of what religions mean in people's lives, of why faith matters, of how religious institutions, for instance, are the original development and humanitarian actors. Before we had governments, we always had and will have religious institutions. Before we had politicians, we have always had religious leaders and will continue to. So there was a tremendous amount of, if you will, lack of proper appreciation for the role of religious actors. Because even though this is the United Nations, it is still a secular institution, and that is wise. It should be a secular institution because 193 governments cannot start dealing with one another on the basis of religion. So it's a good idea that they don't deal with one another on the basis of religion. It's a very good idea that already the struggle is significant to deal with one another as equals in a world that is deeply marred by inequality. So this particular secular establishment, which represents the world's governments, doesn't necessarily know or want to appreciate the vastness of the realms of religion. Because if you put all of these different religious institutions, the leaders, the communities, and the NGOs together, you will find that the United Nations system actually is a great deal smaller in the universe of religions than anticipated, and nobody usually likes to think of themselves as small. The United Nations system understands itself to be vast and big, and it is. You have WHO, you have World Bank, you have UN agencies. The United Nations system is very big. But the truth is that the realms of religion, the worlds of religion, are even bigger. Given this reality, however, it is interesting that we are in a space where the governments matter hugely. We live by virtue of our citizenship to governments, or the lack thereof, which is why we have more than 75 million displaced people all over the world today, the largest number of displaced people in known and accounted human history. We all live by virtue of the governments that we belong to, that we adhere to, that give us our citizenship and ostensibly uphold our rights, or not. Given this reality, it is important for us then to accept the power of the moment when 193 governments agree to something called Agenda 2030, or the Sustainable Development Goals. The United Nations system came together after the Second World War to protect human rights, peace and security, and sustainable development. These three pillars of the United Nations system are also the pillars on which all of us coexist. Many of our institutions exist and need to serve. Religious institutions are the original servants and providers of peace and security, human rights, and sustainable development. That's the truth. Like I said, before we had governments, we had religious institutions. Before we had government-run hospitals, we had and we will continue to have faith-based and faith-inspired clinical, medical services for all communities at all times, including in the furthest, most remote parts of the universe. This is our truth. Agenda 2030 did something remarkable, apart from the fact that it was an opportunity for the first time in many, many years for 193 governments to agree to a global agenda that had 17 milestones on it, 17 goals. 17 milestones, not 8. Remember that the Millennium Development Goals was 8. This is 17. But apart from that wonder, if you will, there is also the reality that the Sustainable Development Goals agenda brought together the peace and security with the human rights, with our sustainable development. It isn't solely an agenda focused on development. It's an agenda that brings it all together. That's why we begin with goals on poverty, but it includes everything from the usual development work on health, education, nutrition, sanitation, employment. It encompasses everything to do with our environment, which is the original peace and security that we all need as human beings. Because if we can't breathe and we can't drink water and we can't eat, we don't exist. So our environment matters hugely to our very existence. And Agenda 2030 captures the most critical goals related to land, earth, air, and water, our environment. And it includes the peace and security component, and throughout it is built on human rights. So this is the value of Agenda 2030 that the UN doesn't own. The UN facilitated that 193 governments arrive at this agenda. But this is an agenda that each of us, all our governments, all citizens, all displaced, own. An agenda that is built on what is necessary for the very survival of our planet and our human species to exist. That's why when we came in Religions for Peace, again, a global movement, to determine what we had to have as priorities, instead of choosing our own words, and of course religious leaders and religious institutions have plenty of words. The original wordsmiths are probably the religious actors. So when you bring religious institutions together to determine the strategic direction, of course there's a lot of words. What we insisted on with our religious institutional members is to say, let's use the language of the Sustainable Development Goals. Let us make sure that as religious communities we can work together to help the governments realize the Sustainable Development Goals. That should be our agenda, at least until 2030. We should be, as religious actors, institutions, leaders, communities, NGOs, we should be committed to the realization of a global agenda on which 193 governments have agreed and which captures all that we need in our lives in order to live, not just live well, but live with dignity. We should be able to do that. So that idea that you have a framework, real life framework, that actually corresponds very well with all our religious values, that life framework should be our objectives and our strategic direction as religious organizations as well. Of course, we justify and we explain and we do our work differently from what governments and secular actors do, because we are religious communities and organizations, but we serve the same purpose of overall well-being and common good as agreed to by the world's institutions. So this is how I think there's an important shift in our mindset as religious actors, religious NGOs in particular. We serve a global agenda of well-being that predates all the global conventions and treaties and institutions as we know them today. But nevertheless is encapsulated, this agenda of global well-being is encapsulated in as minute and imperfect a form as the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. So Agenda 2030 definitely matters for all religious actors who are working in the domain of peace building and security, who are working in the domain of sustainable development, and who are working to uphold human rights. Agenda 2030 is our agenda. It isn't an agenda of somebody else, it is our agenda. In fact, religious actors, again, are the original actors of this agenda. Then COVID happened. And I will share very honestly with you that I was so extremely naive to assume that COVID would push us to work together across our religious differences, across our institutional differences, across our geographical differences, because COVID itself is not distinguishing between North and South or East or West or Muslim or Christian or Jew or Buddhist or Hindu. COVID doesn't distinguish. So I assumed, again naively, that we will come together very strongly. That, by the way, this notion of being able to come together, to work together in spite of our differences, that is the heart of Religions for Peace's mission. That should be at the heart of all religious actors' mission, no matter what holy book or holy scripture inspires. I believe very strongly that we have to work together, especially because we believe. If we believe, we must work together, because the divine is not manifested in only one religion. The divine is manifested precisely in the diversity of faiths. But that, again, I agree, is naive. Because we know that as a result of the environmental degradation that we are witnessing, that we are living today, we know for a fact that most of the challenges that humanity will encounter are going to be humanitarian in nature. Humanitarian crisis is the new normal. We have to do sustainable development. We have to do peace and security. We have to do human rights in the context of humanitarian challenges, not outside of them. The humanitarian challenges will not pause while we do our work. The humanitarian challenges will structure our work. Serving together is the heart of finding the divine. Serving together is where we find the best of ourselves. And the best of ourselves is the breath of the divine. Serving together is what we have not necessarily done very well in the COVID crisis. We have rushed to serve our communities. We have rushed to serve those we normally serve. We have rushed to serve the integrity of our own institutions. We have not necessarily worked very well together across our religious, geographical, institutional differences. And if COVID does not enforce that kind of joint service, to be honest, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what will. I'm not sure that if a global pandemic does not force us to come together, to work together, to serve together, then I'm not sure what will. And I think the point here is not that we lack in service. On the contrary, religious communities have always been the first responders in any and all crisis. This is a documented fact. There's so much evidence. Religious communities are the original development actors and continue to be the bulk of the development actors. The question is not whether we serve. The question has to be, are we collaborating, cooperating, partnering to serve together? Of communities coming together at the very local level. They're Muslim, they're Christian, when they have both coexist. They are Jewish, they're Muslim, they're Christian, where they coexist. They are Buddhist and Hindu, where they coexist. They're coming together to serve the communities together because it's the same needs. It's the same needs. And they are doing it together. And as they come together to serve together, something unbelievable happens. It is in the service that is committed, the hardship sometimes of the service to serve together, that we find the true grit, that incredible gold inside our hearts, that is the spirit of being human and being of service to the divine. We have many examples where just a little bit of resourcing for those with the will, the intention, the creativity, the desire, the design to serve their communities together. We can do this. We must do this. It isn't optional. It is what we need to build our communities. Multi-religious collaboration is not just a moral imperative. Multi-religious collaboration in service to all is what we need to face our divine maker together. It is what we need to ensure that all crises are not just manageable, but are opportunities to show how the divine light shines on all. We must serve together. And that is quintessentially the message. If you prefer secular language, that's the message of the Sustainable Development Goals. Number 17, which is partnership. This, we as faith actors must be the role model of. We partner to serve, not just partner to receive. Blessings upon you all. I look forward to your deliberations.